So welcome back, everyone, to another session of Ask the Editor. I am really excited to be here today with Jonathan Oladeji, founder and editor of we just worked on this, Itanile magazine based in South Africa. Welcome, Jonathan. Thank you so much for coming out today.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
So let's jump right in and tell us, when did you start this magazine? Why did you start it? Tell us the origin story.
Okay, so well, we recently rebranded to Itanile. It's been a little bit older than recently we rebranded about a year ago to Itanile, but the magazine itself has been around for about, I'd say, since 2004. Mm-hmm. I was starting my writing journey, trying to figure out what writing was to me as a Nigerian, an African, and I decided I wanted a community to also share my growth with. So I started a small Facebook group where we would exchange stories. There was also like a growing, sorry, I mixed up the dates. That's 2014, not 2004, that's 2014. I started a small community and would exchange our writing experiences, we exchange our stories, our poems, our essays, would share the journey together. We would collaborate on anthologies. I remember we had anthologies that were just done impromptu, maybe like at Christmas when we wanted to like have a collection of poems that commemorated the experiences we're having at that period of our lives. Or maybe sometimes we thought about Valentine's Day, or we thought about women or the women in our lives, our mothers, and we decided, okay, let's do something to share about our experiences in a collective anthology. So we started to grow the community that way organically. Gradually, we moved from having less than 100 people in a group to thousands in a group.
Wow.
Now we have an email list of more than 2,000 people, and people registered on our website from all around Africa. So I would say that the inception was more or less a personal journey for me. Then it advanced into a community, and then finally into something where we decided we want to give a platform to indigenous African writers who typically may not have the opportunity to publish traditionally. Wanted to give them a place to be heard, a place to connect with new audiences, a place to collaborate and to find community. So then we also started to have a biannual prize where we fund some of the top stories that we get. We give them some cash remuneration, and more recently we've turned that into an annual prize award. That's after we rebranded to Itanile. So yeah, that's a summary of the inception, or is it conception story?
Mm-hmm. That's amazing. So how did you find those writers in the early days? Because I think a lot of people maybe watching this video are also wanting to find writing communities where they are. And it sounds like this is a real success story of you growing your literary community and just sort of like organically finding other writers and readers who are interested in what you're doing. How did you find them? How did you make those connections?
There was something that was happening on social media I would say that was around 2015, 2016, mm-hmm. At least I would say, because we started in Nigeria only. and grew into other African countries. But in the Nigerian social media space, there were a lot of young writers who would organize writing competitions, writing contests, and these were done like regularly and organically. It was not, I don't think many of them were planned. It was just people who were passionate about writing. And a lot of us also got involved with such, especially all the people that were on the team then were also people who were involved with different writing competitions or events on social media. And I was intentional about finding such people and collaborating with them to create events, to create competitions, to create awards and things like that. I got quite involved with that at some point, and I think that made sure that every time we organized an event, it was publicized in a sort of network of friends, and that brought more people who also were interested in such a community, and that made it also grow. So I think that's really how we found people.
So that's interesting. So now you're sort of wearing the editor's hat, which is a little bit different than this kind of like organic friend community, because I think as an editor, you have to select pieces and reject pieces sometimes. So have you found that to be different, surprising in some way, more satisfying, more difficult?
Well, I would just say it's a bit of a transition, having to now go beyond, you know, having friends do things together, and then going to having a pure call for submission, where you're now having to select, okay, what kind of stories do we want to hear? What kind of content do we want to promote? It's a little bit, I would say a little bit more difficult. Then we didn't have any expectations when we started just doing social media competitions. There were no expectations. There was no need to look for funding because, well, we're just doing it for the fun of it. Now there's more expectations because a lot of African writers, as you would know, are still trying to grow their craft. They are looking for opportunities to probably publish their stories traditionally and make some money from that. And any competition they would, you know, any platform or any magazine they would publish in has to be part of what advances their career. So we have to start looking at how do we make sure that the publications we do or the magazines we publish are attractive enough for the kind of readership that these writers want to speak to. We also have to think about other publications or other publishing houses across Africa who are probably who have more resources than we do to support writers. We have to think of how do we not restrict our writers too much, but at the same time help them guide their skills to the point where they can become like really accepted in on bigger platforms. So that has made the editing process or the editorial process a little bit, I'd say, difficult, because we have to think about what's marketable content, but at the same time, we also want people to be able to tell their true stories and not just pursue maybe funding. So we want people to be true to their stories. For example, I was born in Nigeria, and sometimes when I look at the stories about Nigeria that are popular in a lot of magazines, they may not speak to where I come from. They don't often speak to, they seem a bit far off, maybe like a poor representation of the true Nigerian experience. So, but at the same time, I understand that these writers are trying to speak to an audience where they will be accepted. And so there's a fine challenge or a fine line between trying to get marketable content and trying to find the true stories of where we come from, the Africa that we know, the Africa that we are actually connected to. So I think that's the most difficult part of it, trying to find marketable stories, but at the same time not losing sight of what's truly our stories as Africans.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. So it sounds like there's like a tension between stories that speak to people's preconceptions about, and so that sort of make readers feel comfortable because they're familiar with certain ideas about people and a place, versus stories that actually maybe challenge those preconceptions a little bit, but might be truer to people's experiences, but maybe those stories aren't as marketable, so that
Please hold on.
we lost.
Sorry, I just had someone pass through. I didn't know she was going to pass through. Okay. All right. I don't know if that got into the video, but I hope
that's fine. That's fine. It's real life. It's all good.
Well, it's not lockdown, but the COVID thing. I work from home. So.
Oh, okay. No, I won't tell anyone. Yeah, so it's interesting because it's like it seems like maybe what you're saying is like sometimes the stories that feel more marketable are the stories that are and I apologize, there's some construction going on next door, speaking of real life, so that there might create some noise in the background, but
the reality.
Yeah, so there's like a tension between wanting to tell stories that are more surprising or different, but are truer and maybe harder to sell to an audience in some way.
True. And that's, for example, one of the things that started to happen at some point was that we struggled with getting quality stories because we couldn't get the kind of writing that we thought would represent the true African experience, but at the same time be considered quality writing. There were a lot of, we had two recent prizes that we had to shut down temporarily because a lot of the publications coming in seemed forced, like too premature. Some of the young writers wanted their stories to come out, but they are not fully conceptualized the way they want to share the story, the African story. They tell these stories like they are too afraid to explore the topics that they want to write about, or they don't have the right mental structure for the stories that they want to explore. Yet they come to the stories because they want to get a prize, or because they feel that that would give them the foundation they need, or the funding they need to prepare themselves for better opportunities. So yes, there's a place for writers in Africa to commercialize their art form, but at the same time, there's a lot of them need time to be groomed, to be trained. We started doing some workshops at some point to try to help these writers shape up their storytelling, because we realized that what usually happens with African publishing platforms, I have experienced it as a writer, is that once the stories don't fit a particular expectation, we throw them out, we just forget about them. We don't ever go back to these writers to understand why they are struggling with the kind of stories they're struggling with. Why do they think those stories are even important in the first place? We don't invest in them. We simply say, submit to us, we'll publish you if you're good. And that's where it stops. We don't have a lot of the kind of workshops and residencies that you would see probably in the US. I know I've searched for residencies at some point, and I've seen the abundance of them in the US compared to what I would see even in the whole of Africa. Africa has several countries, and I'm sure the whole of Africa may not even boast of the number of residencies in one state in the US. But I'm not too sure. I'm not going to make anything categorical about that, but that's just what I see, is that many of these writers need a space to shape up their storytelling, their skill. Even though their stories are beautiful, they have important aspects of their lives that need to be shared, or parts of their imagination that needs to come into a mainstream storytelling, but they still need help with how they do that storytelling. And that's where we started looking at doing workshops to help them and help our community. So I think generally those are the little things that have been happening with our own editorial process that makes us realize that we can't stick to just editing and accepting or rejecting stories just because we feel that they're not good enough. But that's how our editorial process has been. Sometimes we see these issues and we say, okay, maybe this story was premature. Is there a way we can follow up with these authors? In fact, one of our editors recently spoke to me and was very concerned about the fact that we have to have a form rejection where we don't particularly follow up with those we reject and say, okay, this is actually what you could do better. But of course, it's also because we have limited resources. Our whole team is run by volunteers and has been run by volunteers for years. So we have very limited resources when it comes to also following up with the people who submit to us. So we try as much as possible to personalize our rejections and say, okay, acceptances as well, but we just can't do so much to help them and build up on maybe areas they didn't do so well on. So yeah.
So you're looking for work primarily from people who live in Africa, or are you also open to work from writers who have traveled, who write a story or a poem that's set in Africa?
For a while, since we started, we've only focused on Africans who live in Africa or who have lived in Africa. And there's a reason why we did that. There's a lot of publications or platforms with bigger resources dedicated to writers outside of Africa who are not living in Africa who have not lived in Africa, especially when it comes to telling African stories. There's a lot of resources for those writers out there. But specifically for writers who live in Africa or who have lived in Africa, there's very little focus on this crop of Africans or crop of writers. So that is why we've decided to focus on just those people for now. And I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. We don't have the resources to expand our audience for now.
And are you seeing particular trends in the work that that is being submitted maybe now as opposed to last year, the year before? What are some common things that people are writing about, or is it all over, people just writing about all kinds of different things?
Okay, there was a time in our call for submission where we would theme the submission, and then we had people write based on the themes. But more recently, we decided to leave the writing process open to varying kinds of expressions. We've seen all kinds of writing. We've had one of our winning stories, I think 2017 or 2018, I'm not too sure, was from Ketwe in South Africa, who has gone on to be another very big, well, at least a growing writer in Africa. And our story was, it explored mental health, well, a little bit about mental health. And there have been also similar stories like that. There was a story also, I think that was one of our winning stories that explored terrorism in northern Nigeria. We've had stories explore mostly a lot of the reality that people face in their everyday lives, from family relationships to substance abuse to mental health issues to travel, to even conflict across the continent. So we allow our authors to look at as many things as they can look at, because with Africa, it's almost difficult to set a fixed theme where everyone sees the same thing at the same time. It's almost impossible. I'm in South Africa, and my experiences in South Africa for the past 4 years, I've been living here since 2017. My experiences here are very much different from my experiences, my 20-something years experience living in Nigeria. They're very much different. I have stories for days to tell on that. And I see what a South African would want to write about. It's totally different from what I would want to write about as a Nigerian. Not always totally, but there are a lot of experiences that are disparate and different across the regions. The recent submission, we're still going through the recent submissions for our first issue this year. There were submissions from all over the continent, from Morocco, Cameroon, Kenya, Congo, I mean, it was all over. So, and all these countries have different, will I say, different difficulties and different joys and different pains. For example, in Cameroon, there's conflict between the, well, what is it, the north and south of Cameroon or something, the French-speaking, the Anglophone and the Francophone sides of Cameroon. There's a lot of tension going on there. And some of the Cameroonians are in Nigeria watching the things happening to their family back home. And then there are also those of us in Nigeria who are trying to figure out how would life be for us when we find opportunities to build a business in Nigeria. For example, I built a small business while I was in Nigeria, and I still work on the business while doing my PhD here in South Africa. Those are some of the joys we have. I'm getting married to a South African. Those are some of the joys we have. There are also those, I spent a week or so in Kenya, and I saw some of the kinds of different experiences in the writing community there as well. I was with the Writers Guild Kenya in, was it 2019? And they also have very different experiences that they wish to share. And their stories are just as beautiful as the stories of a Nigerian. So it's usually more beautiful when we allow all these disparate experiences to come together in a way that we don't restrict them, but at the same time we can guide the stories to start creating some beauty out of all the chaos sometimes, which it looks like chaos sometimes, but it's not chaos. We sometimes see the beauty in it. So yeah.
Are there parts of the continent that you tend to get more submissions from? Do you still feel like there are countries or regions that you haven't fully reached in terms of writers and submitters?
initially, like I mentioned, we were focused, or not focused. I dreamed of an African publication, but because I was from Nigeria, most of the initial submissions were from Nigeria. But gradually, with some of the things or the strategy we started to put in place and the relationships we started to form, some other countries became popular, like South Africa, Kenya. Those are like 3 top countries I'll say that we get a lot of submissions from recently. And then, so really interesting for me this year was when I saw submissions from Morocco, and I was, because that's North Africa. Or well, I don't know if I'll call it North Africa, I don't know. But it's really not common to see that in our magazine. So I was happy to see that. And there are new countries also from a bit of Northern Africa who are also starting, but I think that's one of the places where I don't get a lot of interactions with writers from. I think East Africa, West Africa, Southern Africa still seem a little bit close to home to me. Like they feel to me like we would, with the strategies we have been working on, we can always get to these communities. For example, in our previous prizes and workshops, one of the things we started doing was to invite top writers that we could find from different parts of Africa into the workshops. So we had someone from Kenya in one of our workshops. This year we brought Sibongile Fisher who is a very popular writer in South Africa, as one of our judges, because we know that when these judges share about what they are doing, it encourages the writers in their community to also participate in our publication. So we try to find ways to invite exchange from these other communities. I think that was also what motivated my trip to Kenya, where I met the founder of Writers Guild Kenya. And since then, we've shared a kind of camaraderie, I don't know how to say it, but where we exchange information about our events. And so I see a lot of Kenyan writers also coming in from there. And that tells me it's improving. So I would say maybe one place that's still a little bit missing for us is North Africa. It's not really very strong just yet on our magazine, but I don't know about other magazines. So, but yeah.
And what is the literary magazine scene like there? People always say the US, for better or for worse, there are a lot of literary magazines here in the US. Do you find that there are more magazines that are starting to crop up, and are you sort of linking up with other magazines, or do you still, is your journal kind of alone in what it's doing?
The literary magazine scene is really, I would say, underfunded. I think that's the one critical part of it that we're still trying to figure out how to make it work. I know that publications outside of Africa often have maybe patrons, donations, and maybe even sell the anthologies. But writing doesn't seem to be a very commercial business in Africa just yet. Or maybe not because people don't enjoy writing and reading, people do. In fact, when we do when we have our anthologies compiled and we share it with our communities, we've had times when we had thousands of downloads. So it's not that there's no readership. The readership is there. The problem most times is the purchasing power. People don't have the purchasing power to fund literary magazines. People have probably other priorities to spend their income on than buying a digital literary magazine, not to even talk of a print magazine. So, and for a literary magazine to really work, like I explained before, we work with volunteers. And majority of literary magazines who I'm also in contact with struggle with the same thing. We all have to work with volunteers, like writers who probably commit some of their free time to editing and also giving feedback and things like that. And sometimes these people get strained as they also progress in their life journeys. They get busy. I am in my PhD. A lot of those on my editorial team are doing wonderful things, are in new jobs, are working, and we're a purely virtual team. I should say that. In fact, I've probably not met half of the team in person. So, and those things make literary magazines not to live long. The lifespans are very short as far as I've seen. I've seen a number of lit magazines start up and then after a while just fizzle out because they really can't sustain that. It's not something you can leave a job and do. You have to be in a job or have some funding. Even when you have a funding, you still have to be doing something else to manage a lit magazine. So I would say a little bit of a growing space. There are a lot of established ones. I'm not going to say now that there are no established magazines. There's Brittle Paper, there's Lolway, there's Afriada, there's Jalada. There's so many lit magazines out there in Africa. However, these magazines cannot support the sheer volume of writing that should come out of Africa. I'm not saying that's coming out only, that should come out of Africa, because in Nigeria, for example, we are averagely about 200 million people with very disparate experiences, like very different experiences across, I think, more than 600 tribes. I don't know, smaller tribes, but of course we have only 3 tribes recognized in Nigeria, but that's not how Nigeria really is. There are other non-recognized minority groups and things like that. And now when you go into all these communities, you would find at least one writer. So and that's 200 million people. By the time you think about it, even if it's just 1 million, who have that passion, that means there's probably 500,000 of them who would never get an opportunity, who would never be heard, and who would never get to publish a book. Still, the remaining 500,000 would have to struggle with maybe publishing 1 short story in their lifetime and forgetting about writing. And moving on. So then there's just a few people who eventually emerge as, oh, well, Chimamanda. I know everyone knows Chimamanda, but there are a lot of beautiful writers, I promise you, whose names will never be mentioned on that scale, just because, you know, it's too big a market, it's too big a space, and there's no funding for it. So yeah, I think that's really how lit magazines, the lit magazine scene is in Africa. And because of that, what's happening is that now there's a lot of writers who don't look to the African lit magazines anymore. Most submissions now go to magazines outside of our space who can pay maybe $50 per acceptance, $100 per acceptance, something like that, because, you know, it's not even worth the while for many people to pursue their career as writers. I had to go into freelance writing as a job before, so that I can sustain my magazine. So some of my personal income is yearly put into the magazine as the funding to pay the team some time, some stipend, and make it work. and then also the price. So and sometimes we get, what also happens sometimes is that we get to meet people who are purely like interested in supporting the literary space. One of such people has supported our own magazine for a few years now. His name is Collins Elesiro. He's a Nigerian, also lives in the UK. But that's another trend you would see, is that maybe it's more of a bit of a diaspora support. So now a number of, or a crop of Nigerians who are supportive of the creative arts would look to the African Lit magazine to in a form of charity or philanthropy. But it's not sustainable. That's just the way I see it. It's not sustainable at the end of the day, because sometimes these philanthropists have other pursuits and they move on. We've had different sponsors over the years who have come and then moved on to other things. And that's the same for a number of literary magazines I speak to, because I know I'm in contact with, there's another magazine who's a close friend, an editor, Creative Diadem. He's in Canada. That's a founder, an editor. He's in Canada, but he runs a magazine that's mostly focused on Nigerian authors. And basically the same thing applies. You have to work hard in some way to bring partners who may be interested, maybe because they're from Nigeria, or maybe because they're Africans, and they just want to support the younger writers, and they're just like, okay, let's fund a literary magazine. And that's just where it stops, once in a while. So yeah, I think that summarizes it a bit.
Yeah, it's interesting because I would say magazines are very underfunded here in the US also, but it somehow hasn't stopped editors from cropping up and starting new journals. But it sounds like you're very interested in getting funded to pay your staff, which is great, because most editors, I think, are volunteer. And then also to pay writers. Did you say, I might have missed whether you said?
Yes. We currently do an annual award where we pay the top stories that we've published in the year. We would have loved to do more, but we know that we have limited resources, so we only try to reward in other ways, like we share their work, we promote their work. Just as me coming to this interview is a way to also spread the word about what these writers are doing. We find other ways. There was a year we collaborated with a publishing company in Canada to do a print publication of some of the anthologies we put together. And those are some of the ways we try to help put out more word about some of the stories coming out of our magazines and anthologies. But also we would really want to be able to also pay better, but it's just what it is. And also for our volunteers, they do a thankless job. They are always, I push them, I know that. I push them to, do workshops, organize the editorial process, find new voices that we need to work with, and so on. So many things like that. So yeah, those are some of the things. We really hope that in the future, we are more capable of paying both our volunteers and not pay them a salary, but just something to say thank you for really putting out your time to look at other people's work, and not just yours. Because even our editors are also ambitious writers who also, one of our editors won a publishing prize a few years ago. I've also won a few writing awards and published my work in a number of places. So all our editors are very ambitious young people. And so I sometimes feel guilty to tell them, okay, no, we need to just get this done. I mean, so, but yeah, it's what it is. We really enjoy what we do, and I think that's something to be, grateful for. I'm happy that I still can count on them after so many years. Some have been with me for almost all the 6-7 years since the magazine has started. So yeah, it's a lot.
That's great. Can you share, I don't know if you want to choose favorites, but maybe for our audience, can you share 1 or 2 pieces from your magazine recently or over the course of its history that you just feel like, yes, this is why I do this. This is why I created this magazine. If you have time today to read 1 thing from our site, please go read this piece by this writer.
Well, I've mentioned the one that comes to mind. That's from Reseketswe Maneze. If you go to our website and you search for the name, you should find Reseketswe's story. And it's the one that really always comes to mind for me, because it spoke to not just the fact that it spoke about mental health. It was a story set in part of it was set in a bar, 2 strangers meeting and having a conversation about, their contemplation on suicide. Recently, a lot of young writers, don't let me say a lot of, a number of young writers in the Nigerian literary space have, I don't know if there should be a trigger warning for this part of the show or the interview, but they took their own lives, maybe for, I don't know for what reason, but for so many reasons. And sometimes the stories we read about Africa romanticizes the pain of people. It makes it look like we're trying to sell pain. But we're not trying to sell pain. It's just that the reality in Africa is one where a lot of brilliant people are not given the opportunities they deserve. They work hard, they have aspirations, and those aspirations don't find a root. And that's really what I loved about that story, and why it remains stuck in my head. I've read too many stories to remember all of them, but that's really why that story stuck with me. Is just the fact that as ordinary as life could be, it's also sometimes quite profound what people think about, and then decide that, okay, it's not worth living in this experience, which is Africa. So it's not just about people it's not just poverty, it's not just, which is often what the story is. Africa is poor, that's why people live desperate lives, but that's not really always the case. There are a number of these young people who are from a little bit of a privileged home, but they just don't have enough of their real experience being acknowledged sometimes. I don't know. And this is how I would feel, or if I would explain how I feel about Africa sometimes, is that I know if someone struggles with mental health problems, and they also have to deal with the fact that their real lived experiences are not being told. No one is really listening to them, and everyone wants them to say certain kind of story about where they come from. Then the chances are that it's like a trap. You feel trapped. So those are just a few thoughts I've had about that story, and I think everyone should read that story. I've also had some of my works published on platform, because I won't give a platform that I don't want to also share on to others. So I have my story also on the platform, which I would say you can look for. It's a bit of, will I say satire, but it's also a bit of a way to show the reality that I've seen happen, or things I've seen happen. My story talks about a person who was in a shanty part of the country, sleeping with, it was a kind of, how will I put it, a cheating man and the wife of a poorer, less privileged driver. And in the process, the story led to a lynching. And as much as the story was first exploring how love or romance can still evolve in some of the poorest parts of the world, people still love, people still passionately connect with themselves for different reasons, sometimes very logical reasons, and sometimes not even for, not the right, you wouldn't say, cheating is a good thing, but, someone sees a beautiful woman and he wants the beautiful woman, and that happens in Africa. People want people. So I wanted to explore that, how those kind of relationships also lead to some of the violent stories we hear about. We may think violence is just because people are violent in Africa, but it's not just that. Sometimes it's just the human passion. People want things, and they see someone who has what they want. Also in the story, there was a thug who saw this rich person at some point and wanted some kind of help from the rich person, but didn't get it. So when the richer person was caught in an affair, he was motivated to join in the lynching because there's something that person wants that he wants to have. The rich person also wanted to have the wife of his driver. And you see, that's really one of the things that happens in Africa, is that a lot of people want things they can't have, and it leads to the same violence you see anywhere in the world, because a lot of our human needs are scarce. We don't have enough of the resources we want, and then because of that, people compete, and that competition can sometimes go bad. So that's really what inspired that story for me. And I'm just sharing the two stories, that mine and the other one that I think you would find really interesting if you look for it on the site. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. It's such a great project. So are there ways for people to get involved, or do you, for people outside of Africa to get involved, or are there not those opportunities?
Yeah, we are open to sponsorship. That's the first one. That's one way to get involved. Usually, we have sometimes even our, let me just pause it. Can I go on?
You can turn your video. Oh, okay.
So we have some of our funding coming mostly from Nigerians, like I said. Recently, someone even started, just donating $20 every month to us. And that has gone to help us a bit. But also we think anyone that believes that there are stories in Africa that they really want to hear about, and they know that, they from this interview, I think anyone that listens to this will be sure that there are a lot of stories you've never heard about in Africa. A lot of things that you don't know that's happening in Africa, or that you don't really fully understand the context of those events. So if you think that that's something you would want to support and make sure that such stories come out, then you might want to sponsor what we are doing. Other ways you can support us is to talk about our share our magazines with readers outside of Africa. I sometimes reach out to editors that are outside the African community. I think I reached out to talk, I'm not really sure if it's the full name. I'll remember the name later, but it's a UK-based TS Publishing. I'm not sure. I think that's the name, TS Publishing in the UK. And they were, benevolent enough to share one of our magazines, TSS Publishing, on their website. And one of their editors gave a commentary on what we were doing. And that also, I believe, was something that the authors or the writers felt like a reward for them, that, okay, there's an audience out there looking at what we're saying or looking at our stories. And I think that's another way you can support African Lit magazines, not just us, but African Lit magazines. You can always support through those ways. Well, I don't know, there are other ways you could support us, but I would want you to maybe send us an email and tell us, okay, maybe this is what we can do to collaborate with you. We are always open to collaborations and partnerships, and that's something that we would like to discuss. We've always dreamed about having a kind of reading app of our own that's African-based. Amazon is Amazon Kindle and Amazon Print are mostly for the US market and Canada and the UK. So most of our authors who venture onto such platforms don't often, they can't sell their work so much because they don't have an audience yet on those platforms. So we've been thinking about also having our own platform where we publish a reading app that publishes stories directly from these authors, almost like your Amazon Kindle, but more attuned to the African space. So that would be one way that eventually, if we find the sponsorship for that, we would be happy to set that up for our writers and help them to put their stories out there. So that's another way to work with us.
So that's really interesting. So if a journal editor maybe out there is watching this video and they decide they're going to host a reading with a few other lit mags and they reached out to you, that might be something that you and your staff would be interested in participating in, is a reading with other American or even European lit mags. That would be really cool.
Absolutely. That reminds me also, well, if there are also residencies that would be willing to invite some of our writers, that would help. We would be happy to talk to some of our top story authors, or even all the authors, and just give the invite to them that whoever is interested in a residency, from our recommendation, we can recommend some of them to such communities or such residencies. And editors who may be interested in also reading sessions with some of these authors, we would be happy to invite them to such opportunities.
That's great. That's great to know about. Well, thank you so much, Jonathan, for taking the time. And actually, I have one last question, which is just, can you tell me the definition? What is the name of your magazine? What does it mean?
The magazine is called Itanile. Itanile is a Yoruba word. I am Nigerian. I'm also Yoruba. Yoruba is a native language in Nigeria, and Itan means stories. Ile is home. So when you bring those two words together, it's stories of home or stories from home. And it was inspired mostly because we realized our stories tie back to what it feels like to be at home in whichever part of Africa you're in. And a lot of people, even outside Africa, refer to Africa as home. Africa is home to a lot of people. So we believe that our stories should bring you back to home and should help you feel like you're connecting to some kind of roots. So that's really where the name comes from. And that's what it means.
That's beautiful. Well, it was great to meet you and great to hear about this magazine. And thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
My pleasure.